So I'm going to tell you a couple stories, basically. And these are stories that I'm puzzling about. And there's BSE is a big reason for part of this story. But all of these stories come from the fact that after BSE in Alberta, they suddenly decided they didn't have enough social science research, and so they threw money at social science researchers, and we ended up with a couple of $1 million in my department, which allowed us to buy extraordinarily expensive data sets, and then the question was what to do with them. And so I had lots of ideas. Some of my grad students not so much, but they've struggled through. So this is mostly a work that has been done by some of my grad students over the years, and a postdoc from Germany. So basically, the simple story is that consumer theory is maximizing utility subject to a budget constraint, and how you look at changes in utility and how you try and figure out if there are changes in utility is something that I don't think we do very well. And all of the all of the stuff that goes on around all these trendy attributes of local and organic and all of this kind of stuff is coming from somewhere. And so our research program is basically about trying to figure out where it's coming from and what's driving it. It turns out, my gut feeling is it's almost all some level of risk aversion. And so it's a bit worrying because it's not coming from a positive place, it's coming from a negative place. Although most of the consumers who feel most strongly about some of these attributes can't articulate that. And so that's why I'm interested in risk perceptions, and I'm increasingly interested in stuff like trust and whether you trust the food industry or not. And it's sort of related to your risk perception. So that's how we got to looking at some of these things. When I started working at the University of Alberta, I realized that the big methodological push at the University of Alberta was choice modeling on the resource and environmental side, and they'd also done a lot of stated preference work on food, looking at genetically modified food and attributes and a few other things. So I thought, oh dear, and I don't know anything about this. I don't even know how to do it, and it's too complicated econometrically for me, so I better figure it out. So we use a lot of stated preference techniques, and I make abundant use of my colleagues there to help me design interesting experiments. But there's always problems with stated preference because it's hypothetical behavior, and it should basically only be used for attributes that don't exist in the marketplace. Although my colleagues increasingly use it for anything they feel like. Colleagues in the broadest sense. I mean, the papers I have to review from people, and I keep thinking, why are you doing stated preference when you can just get revealed preference data and find out who is actually buying the product in the first place? But really, if you have products that don't exist, then you can use stated preference, or attributes that don't exist in the marketplace. So, I've already said that. So there's problems with stated preference. And so what I was interested in was whether or not you could bundle revealed preference data together with stuff on attitudes and stated preference for the same households or the same respondents, and see if there was consistency. Because it would shed more reliability on the stated preference stuff if you knew their attitudes reinforced that, and their actual purchasing behavior reinforced that. So we had this truckload of money apropos of BSE. So we started buying really expensive data sets, and we wanted to see how attitudes and stated preference behavior were consistent with revealed preference behavior. So that's where we start. So if you go back to 2003, and I was actually in Australia, I think John Freebairn told me that we had a cow with mad cow disease in Alberta. Between getting on a plane that afternoon and getting back to Alberta, the entire cattle industry, I mean, it does take 15 hours to get back to Alberta. It wasn't, an hour later, but the entire cattle industry in Canada had shut down because of this one mad cow in 2003. The cow was actually slaughtered in January, and they didn't confirm that it had BSE till May, which is kind of an interesting story in and of itself, because we have another prion disease in Alberta that I've also done a lot of work on, which is called chronic wasting disease. And we had chronic wasting disease is in deer and elk and moose, and we're worried about it being in caribou. Once it's in caribou, we have problems with food security in the north like you wouldn't believe. And so the labs in Alberta that test these things were focusing exclusively on the deer farming and the elk farming industry because they were finding examples of chronic wasting disease, and they didn't, and the wild animals testing as well. And particularly when you've got a disease that spreads between wild and domesticated animals and you don't know what the mechanism is, it's particularly concerning. So they thought, oh, well, we don't have anything in cattle. We'll just leave that head, you know, for I don't know how long, 6 months almost, before we test it. And then, oh, crap, it did have mad cow disease. What had happened to the carcass, nobody says. We have found 20 more animals subsequently in Canada with mad cow disease. Since then, we have a very high level of testing. And we argue with the United States regularly about whether we cause BSE in their cattle or vice versa. So that's what happened to exports of live cattle. Up until that point, Canada was exporting about 1.5 million head of cattle a year to be slaughtered in the US. We had no slaughter capacity for those animals. Overnight, we couldn't export those animals. So lots of things happened. This is what happened on the beef side, and you can see the same dip in beef exports, which is the green line around the finding of mad cow disease. Beef wasn't such a big deal. It closed in May. By September, it was open to animals over 30 months of age. What was the deal? Animals younger than 30 months of age that we only took muscle cuts, so the high-end cuts could go to the U.S. So cattle were valueless, almost. The two biggest meat packers in Alberta and in Canada were both multinational American firms who had the border open to exporting high-value cuts, who were shorting the U.S. market for a lot of cattle, so the price of beef had gone way up in the U.S. They were selling expensive cuts in, paying very little for the cattle they were slaughtering, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to slaughter the extra cattle, and they were making money hand over fist. They were very happy to keep the border closed as long as they possibly could, and phoned regularly to the USDA to make sure the border stayed closed as long as possible. And when the Canadian government said, we'd like to look at your books, they said no. And that was it. The blue line at the top is there for disappearance, and everybody in Canada who talks about the beef industry says, we did a great job. We did a great job in Canada. Nobody stopped eating beef. As a matter of fact, people ate a little bit more beef. And so that's the story I'm going to tell you. Just to show you how dramatic the change in steer prices was, it fell precipitously as soon as we closed the border to live animal trade, and it's taken quite a long time in real terms to get up to anywhere near the same level. The drought in the U.S. helped us last year. Okay, so by the way, this is the long-term trend in per capita disappearance in beef in Canada, so it's not like we're eating more beef year over year. Our population is growing, which is why disappearance seems flat. And if anything, BSE sort of stabilized it for a couple of years, but basically we just continue to decline in terms of per capita consumption. So what did we do that was interesting? First of all, we did a whole bunch of time series analysis of per capita disappearance and linked it to media coverage of BSE and all sorts of things. And I'll show you a picture of the media coverage. We didn't have a single article that ever said anything about BSE and human health. Actually, all of those articles had come out earlier, before Canada ever had a BSE case in terms of the UK. So all the articles that were about BSE were talking about poor farmers and how hard done by the cattle industry was. And we had transport trailers out in front of every grocery store selling ground beef there. And I'm pretty sure everybody felt really loyal and filled up their freezers with frozen beef. And I'm pretty sure a lot of that got thrown out in the end. But because people remembered it sort of 5 years later and didn't want to eat it anymore. So there was kind of a knee-jerk reaction that we needed to support farmers. But I was more interested in how individuals were actually responding. So Nielsen is a home scan panel thing. They collect data in Canada on about 12,000 households a year, and they get data on everything they purchase. So we could only afford to buy their meat purchases, and we managed to get it back to 2002, so we had at least a year before BSE hit. But the interesting thing that we did is in 2008, although this is a long time post-BSE, we went in and did a major survey, which is really expensive if you want them to do a survey for you. So we had a whole bunch of data on what individual households within that panel would purchase, and we had their purchase history from 2002 to 2009. But we had data on what their risk perceptions were and risk attitudes and a whole bunch of other things. And so we wanted to see if we could compare some of these things and model them. So risk perceptions is basically, and I'm only lifting things from the literature here. I'm not justifying it. But risk perceptions is about the actual level of risk you believe exists, in this case, in eating beef. And risk attitudes is, and we model it based on a whole bunch of research by Pennings and Schroeder from Kansas State with these sort of questions. And they look duplicative and all of that sort of stuff. So you take an average of those three questions and say that's something about a risk perception. And then the risk attitude is how much risk you're willing to accept. And so we had data from our survey on this, and we had data on a whole bunch of households. It turns out almost 5,000 households that had purchased meat, all sorts of meat, between 2002 and 2009. So what were we going to do? We did the same survey again in 2011 with the same households. There's a problem with these households, of course, because these households have stayed in a very labor-intensive market survey for a very long time. So what do you think they are? They're generally older households. They're generally better educated households. They're people who like, the younger people will go in and out pretty quickly nowadays, and so we aren't capturing them. So demographically, they're a bit older and perhaps not representative of the population in some, but at least we know everything about how they've behaved. We also can track their demographics across time. They may have had kids at the beginning and they don't have kids at home anymore. Their income changes. Sometimes their education even changes, so we can monitor those, and their pets and a few other things that we get information on. So we did the same survey questions in 2011. So from this, it doesn't look like there was very much change in these households' attitudes. Just for curiosity, we pulled apart for the 2011 data. If your household says they're a beef-eating household, or if they say they're not a beef-eating household, so there's clearly some link between your risk perceptions and risk attitudes and whether or not you eat beef. And we compared across three meats. The 2011 survey was actually about venison because it was paid for out of the chronic wasting disease research. But you can see that people were willing to accept a lot more risk from eating beef, which is what a high risk attitude means. And their actual risk perceptions about beef is very low. It could have been a maximum of 5. So for venison, which most people don't eat, they think it's more risky and they're not willing to accept the risk, and pork sort of falls in between. Okay, so what did we do in modeling these things? We had all these 5,000 households. We tracked data on media coverage of a whole bunch of food safety related things. We created prices. Prices are a problem in the home scan data. And we did cluster analysis on the basis of people's risk perceptions and risk attitudes. And we found out that they were significantly different across clusters. And I don't want to say too much about this, but if you look at group 1, their risk perception index is 1.3 out of a possible 5. So they don't think beef is very risky at all. And their risk attitude index is 4.4 out of a maximum of 5, which means they would eat beef till the cows come home. A group 2 is a bit more neutral. They have a lower, they have a higher risk perception index and a lower risk attitude index, so they're sort of in the middle. And group 3 has, strangely, a very low risk perception index, but is not willing to accept the risks of eating beef. So they don't actually think beef is all that risky, but if they do think it's risky, they don't want to eat it. It's so very different kinds of behavior. My PhD student was ready to kill me because he came and I knew there were 5,000 households that had done the survey and that we had data on, and he came back and said, here's my analysis for 4,200 households. And I said, what happened to the other 800? And he said, they said they didn't eat beef, so I'm not going to analyze them. And I said, I think your thesis is about what are the effects of BSE, and it could be that BSE caused them to not be eating beef. So maybe we should look at them. And he said, well, they didn't answer these risk perception, risk attitude questions because they said they didn't eat beef. And it's really interesting because they all did eat beef. We went back, and he hadn't checked that. So I said, you have to go back into the data and find out if those particular households did eat beef. And they all did eat beef, and they all ate meat, but they ate it at a much lower level. So there's a distinct possibility that the person that responded to the survey didn't eat beef, but that did buy it for the household. So we clumped them together as a separate group because they were a bit idiosyncratic. So we have 4 groups. 3 of them that we clustered on the basis of risk attitudes and risk perceptions, and the group 4 is the one that said they didn't eat meat. And you can see their expenditure is much lower, and across all the 4 meats, they're much lower. The interesting thing is the pattern of expenditure, which is on average over the 7 years, is not that different across the other 3 clusters. I mean, beef is the most expensive, this is expenditure, which is why it shows up as, if you took it on a quantity basis, they're not eating a lot of beef compared to the other meats. Pork's pretty cheap in Canada usually. Chicken is more expensive because of supply management, so we actually eat less chicken per capita than a lot of countries. And we had turkey in there well, of course, everybody ate it this week. In case you didn't know, it's Canadian Thanksgiving this week. So we wanted to model it based on what was going on in the media about various things. So we tracked media coverage. This is just from our major national newspaper, but you can see there was a lot of BSE coverage around 2003, 2004. Just so you know, listeria outbreak at a maple leaf plant in Toronto killed 27 people in Canada. It started in late 2008, so that's the green coverage. 2012, huge recall due to E. coli at one of the big plants in southern Alberta, which closed borders to product from that plant, had international repercussions, affected every province in Canada, 45 states in the US, and 5 foreign countries. Big plant. Little bit of E. coli goes a long way. Nobody died. Lots of media coverage. So, I'm not going to tell you all about the econometric results and all of that sort of stuff. Massively interesting differences in the price responsiveness and the responsiveness to media coverage of food safety incidents across the 4 groups. So we have 4 groups, 3 that were clustered, and 1 that was a group that said they didn't eat meat, but they actually did eat meat. So what we did is, since we'd included the media coverage in as an explanatory variable, we went back in and simulated taking out half of the media coverage of the various food safety incidents. So you can see how different across the groups the response to BSE actually was. The group 3 was the most wary group, if you like. The risk perceptions weren't high, but they were the ones that had the really low risk attitude, the really lack of willingness to accept the risks. And so if you get rid of the media coverage, their beef expenditure goes up the most. The patterns are the same because the media coverage is the same. But the other 2 groups, the confident and the sort of in-between group, had very similar patterns. And then these peculiar people who said they didn't eat beef actually responded in the opposite way. But we compared that to getting rid of some of the E. coli coverage. And the thing that's interesting, if you think about it, the E. coli scale is the same. So when you have an E. coli outbreak, you get a bigger spike immediately in terms of your response. The BSE effects last much longer, and actually are bigger in those sorts of terms. So E. coli, you respond when it's there, you go back to eating the product when it's not there. And although the size of the response is different across the 3 groups, the pattern is much the same. The response to BSE is very, very different, and it's clear that from the analysis we've done about changing risk perceptions across time, that things like BSE scare everybody a lot more than E. coli does. And I could have shown you the listeria graph. It's very similar to the E. coli graph, and it actually kills people. And the BSE's never even made anybody sick, as far as we know, in Canada. We have had 2 people die from the human variant of mad cow disease in Canada, and it's proven categorically that they did not get it in Canada. That one of them lived for a long time in the UK, and the other one lived in Egypt and ate all that UK meat that was exported to Egypt. So we know for a fact they didn't get sick from eating Canadian beef. Okay, so that's the story about risk perceptions. We were modeling the household behavior, and what we did was we arbitrarily divided the groups somewhat, but using cluster analysis into different groups on risk perceptions. Can't actually test whether, it's hard to statistically test whether the price elasticities and all of those things are different, but empirically they come out to be very different. So the other thing that we looked at that was a similar sort of attitude is we wanted to find out if trust in the food industry, and particularly in meat processors, was changing and how that was affecting things. So you don't probably care about this, but we use a couple different constructs around trust. Basically the trust literature, which would say that there's sort of a general trust in people, and there could be very specific levels of trust in particular agents, and that's an oversimplification. And so we're working with some colleagues in Europe on different scales about trust in various industries. So this, in general, would you say that most people can be trusted is a very basic question that's used in a lot of general social surveys, and it's a really good indicator, it turns out, of lots of things about trust. But we got into a lot more detail about whether you trust the government around food safety, whether you trust manufacturers, retailers, farmers, and restaurants in this case. And I'm going to tell you about a completely different data set that we worked on. So there's a series of 6 questions. 2 of them relate to your actual knowledge and technical competence to deal with food safety. Do you think these people, government, manufacturers, retailers, all those people know enough to deal with food safety? In Canada, we believe they know enough. But then there's 4 questions that deal with your honesty, openness, and whether we think you take care of things or not. And we don't think they do that so well in Canada. And that's in general the result. So we wanted to find out if there were linkages between these trust variables, these different trust variables, and the example I'm going to give you was a demand for traceability. And it was a demand for traceability for food that you eat in restaurants. So when you eat in a restaurant, do you want to know that your food is traceable back to the farm of origin or not? And I'm intrigued about local, I guess is the way to say it. So I used local as the attribute that could be traceable back to the farm of origin. We split the sample so that half of the people in our survey were making stated choices around hamburgers, and half of them were making stated choices around steak dinners, because it struck me that maybe it's different when you go to McDonald's than when you go to a fancy restaurant. So I wanted to test that. And we surveyed 3,000 people, and we surveyed households out of something called an NPD, it's another market research company data set, which is where they collect data on whether people, all the foods that individual households eat at restaurants. So it's basically a restaurant purchasing data set. So we had all kinds of demographic detail, and we had history on these people's restaurant purchases. And then we asked them stated preference questions. So we had both their revealed preference and some stated preference and responses to trust questions. So the stated preference thing looked like that if you were in the steak exercise, and basically we changed price, and it was either traceable or verified or not, and local or not. So it could be local without being verified. So just to give you an idea about the trust data from the survey we did on these over 3,000 households that we had restaurant purchasing data on, In general, we trust farmers up the wazoo. Interestingly enough, we always trust farmers, but we also always want to tell them what to do. They are not to use antibiotics, they're not to use this or that. I found out we don't believe in them using vaccination either, which worries me about livestock production. We want them to produce environmentally sustainable, and we think we know better about how they should produce, but we trust them the most. Interestingly enough, we didn't trust the government very highly at that particular time. Usually it comes out second and the commercial entities come out less, but for some reason manufacturers and government switched places in that particular survey. So the first time we did this data, we split the people. We were looking at restaurants, we were looking at traceability in restaurants, so we thought we would just pick out the trust in restaurant stuff, and we split the sample into two groups. Either you had high trust in restaurants with some arbitrary cutoff around 3, or you had low trust in restaurants. And 36% of the sample had high trust in restaurants around food safety, and 64% had low. And we compared that around some of these generic trust questions. So if you thought that restaurants were very trustworthy, you also thought people could be trusted. So you were, in general, a more trusting person, and vice versa for the low trust. Okay, so we've got two groups. We modeled the two groups separately, and we looked at the willingness to pay for the local, and this is for the combined local and traceable attribute, on the steak dinner, not on the hamburgers. And what I wanted you to see is that I calculated it for each respondent in the sample, so there would be about 1,900 responses in this particular survey. And there is a statistically significant difference between the high trust average willingness to pay and the low trust average group's willingness to pay for local and traceable. And the distributions look a little bit different, but this is splitting them in two and estimating them as two separate models. So the low trust people have a slightly wider distribution, and the high trust people have a slightly higher willingness to pay. So is that what you thought, that the high trust people would be? Gary said that he told me that this morning. That was exactly what he thought, because he has incredible intuition. So we had actually thought the low trust people would want to pay for certification and verification and traceability more than the high trust people. It turns out now, and we've done about 10 studies of this sort, that the high trust people are always willing to pay more for the attributes, or say they're willing to pay more for the attributes than the low trust people are. So you have to figure out whether that makes sense or not. My science colleagues say it doesn't make sense, and so we fight about it a lot. So the other type of analysis we did is I did cluster analysis on a broader set of questions around trust, and clustered these 3,000 households into 3 separate groups, where I arbitrarily said this was a high trust group, a low trust group, and a medium trust group. And I essentially used these cluster identity things as dummy variables, but only estimated one model for the entire data set, and looked at the same attributes around willingness to pay for these things. So the results come out like that. First of all, the cluster membership is massively statistically significant in explaining differences in the multinomial logit model that you run on the choices that people make when they have to choose a hamburger or a steak dinner. And you can sort of see a pattern, so that the low trust people are willing to pay less than the high trust people. The medium ones are a little bit inconsistent. So for the attribute local, and you were buying a hamburger, you were willing to pay $1 more if you were a low trust group for it being identified as local, but you were willing to pay $1.25 more if you were a high trust cluster member. The value of a hamburger was $4.50, and the prices that we used in the experiment went up from there. So that's the premium that you were willing to pay for the attribute. So you get to both attributes, and you're willing to pay more for both attributes than one, and the patterns are generally consistent. On the $20 steak dinner, the values are more because the prices are more, but you get exactly the same pattern. But if I went back to the averages, I'm trying to think if it was $20 or if it was $22, I can't remember, but if you went back to the actual data, you found out that the premium on average was exactly the same, whether you were buying a hamburger or a steak dinner. So the premium in percentage terms was pretty consistent. So there's something there about preferences that we're now doing some more empirical work to see if we can unpack. But again, high trust people willing to pay the most for these attributes. The one thing I haven't done is interacted the cluster membership with the price responses and the attribute responses to see if this is essentially a way of shifting the demand equation up and down, but it's not actually allowing the demand equation to change shape or whatever. I started out by saying I was really interested in using this data and having both revealed preference and stated preference stuff together, and I've just talked about the stated preference part and the links to attitudes here. But we did use the revealed preference data in some senses, because we put some of the things like the household's actual expenditure on fast food restaurants versus full service restaurants in as explanatory variables into the model, and they're all massively statistically significant. So if you spend more money on non-fast food restaurants, you actually want these attributes more than if you spend the bulk of your food away from home budget on fast food restaurants. So I don't know if I have anything more to say. Do I have anything more to say? Yeah. That's it, basically. So in both examples, we thought that we were finding more informative patterns of behavior when we started to combine actual household purchasing data with both stated preference and attitudinal data. And we're not sure we've got the answer yet, but there seems to be a lot of stuff in there that we could do more with. On this particular local and traceable one, it's important to remember that the higher the trust level, the more you're willing to pay for attributes, and I can tell you that applies to almost every attribute we've looked at. The scientists think that's completely counterintuitive. They think it's going to pull the low trust people back into the market, and it doesn't seem that that's the result that you're going to get at all. And we got a sensible result on the responses to food safety incidents, but surprisingly, the biggest response was from a group that had very low risk perceptions, but also very low willingness to accept risks. And we're not sure what drives those people's behavior. If you think the risk of eating beef is so low, why are you so unwilling to accept the risk of eating beef? It could be a health attribute that we didn't pick up somewhere in our questions, so we're doing some more investigation of that. And that is all I was going to say. So that's it.